individuals who, excuse me, have been here for countless years. And with that, does anybody have a declaration of pecuniary interest or conflict of interest in regards to the following agenda? Even though you could argue our first point, we all have a conflict of interest, but let's all declare that we are interested in the first topic. We might be interested in conflicts. We'll see how the discussion goes. And I don't think we have any for open forum. And therefore, I have in front of me, moved by Councillor Graziano, second by Councillor Jarvis, be it resolved, the Committee of the Whole adopts the agenda of January 10th, 2023 as circulated. All those in favor? And I'm seeing lots of hands, so that is carried. Thank you. And the first item on deck is hybrid meetings, attendance, and council remuneration review from our clerks department. And Ms. Way, you're representing the clerks department this morning?
I am, yes. So as you know, we've done some upgrades to the council chambers to accommodate hybrid meetings post-pandemic. With that came the provisions of laptops for all of our council members. Previously, there was an IT stipend that was provided to all members in order to provide your own devices at the beginning of a term. Obviously, we need to reevaluate what that IT stipend may look like now that devices have been provided, but also acknowledging that there is internet connectivity costs that are also required when attending from home. What this meeting allowance may look like moving forward. It's been a couple of years since we've had to pay any type of mileage or meeting allowance. So what that may look like moving forward from a council standpoint, because currently the meeting allowance is paid as part of your salary. It's two separate amounts, but we kind of pay it equally distributed. Did we want to move to a mileage per kilometer basis? And if we do that, then how are we accommodating outside moving into the township mileage versus boat access from a cottage perspective? So basically we are looking at wanting to know how council wants to move forward with all of these changes in this new format that we are looking at, and we are looking for direction.
So you didn't come to us with a recommendation. Well, you're making it difficult for us.
Yes.
And you enjoy that fact.
Normally I would love to provide a strong recommendation, but in this case, we're really looking for direction from council.
Well, let's break it down into, you broke it down into three components, and I think if we discuss each one separately, it might ease our discussion. And the first one is in-person attendance imposition as versus hybrid or remote attendance, however you want to word it.
And the percentage of if
yes.
There's going to be a percentage or minimum number remote versus in-person, etc.
So I'm going to start it with the assumption that we want to maintain that we attend in one form or another. In other words, if somebody's absent, whether it's hybrid or in person, 3 meetings in a row without explanation, we have an issue. So let's not even talk about that part. I'm suggesting, unless you think I'm totally out to lunch, and let's talk about going forward. What percentage of time should we require councillors to be physically present in the room versus hybrid? And I'm open to anyone putting their hand up first and volunteering their ideas. And seeing none, we'll move on to the Oh, now we got excited. I knew that would get somebody's attention. Okay, so we're going to go Bocheck, Cooper, Hazelton for our first start, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think this whole topic should be prefaced with under normal circumstances. If we're in a state of emergency or if we're under a pandemic or whatever, obviously, things are going to be quite different. But under normal circumstances, I think council members in general try to be in person as much as possible. There's a lot to be said about the water cooler effect, and the more we can be together, the better. There is circumstances where we're not able to be at council meetings, and the Zoom provides us with a a very good avenue to participate in the meetings and be an active part. So I would think that in most cases, I know in the past that if you did not attend two meetings in a row, then you were kind of called up and said, you know, what's going on and why aren't you attending these meetings? Of course, there was no Zoom back then, so you missed out completely on everything. So it was more important. I truly think that being adults and we all want to participate, that we're going to be there as much as possible. And I don't know if putting a number on really means anything, but I really don't see any reason why any councillor would miss 2 meetings in a row unless you're away 60 days or 90 days or something. I guess that would be it, but I don't know that there's a need for a firm number outside of we all do our best to attend meetings in person.
I mean, one suggestion was 50% have to be in person. And you're saying, I suppose, Councillor Bocek, if we don't put a number in, we would be in a situation where somebody could be 100% remote.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if I'm really the one to be putting the number into place, but I see no reason why a councillor would miss more than 1 meeting in a row. You know, there may be one, you may have to miss 1 committee of the whole meeting in December, and then maybe in July you can't make a meeting because of some reason. Then, you know, that should be fine, as long as you're zooming in. But if you're not participating, I think that's a whole different story.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And to the first point that you raised, Mayor, I think if we stay with our current rule regarding missing 3 meetings in a row, which should be fine. I mean, people can get sick, and I think we need to be mindful of that. So as Councillor Bocek has said, we're all adults here, and we're going to try and attend. But I think what we've had in place is reasonable. It's and so as far as that's concerned, I think we should go with what we've had, as you suggested. But coming to sort of some of the other points with respect to in-person attendance, I think it's important for us to consider that at least in the summer months or 6 months of the year, there are 5 councillors here who are coming by water access. So we need to keep that in mind. I think it's important to also note that they're in non-summer months. There are 6 councillors here, many of whom are traveling significant distances, anywhere from under 100 to almost 200 kilometers each direction to get to a meeting. So there's a lot of time associated, not just cost, but time associated with attending meetings. And it's not like you should, I think the rule in the past for both the district and the township of Georgian Bay, when you get to the border of the township, you start qualifying for mileage. Well, that would be just peachy, because our administrative office is about 1 kilometer from the beginning of our township. So forget about the other 150 kilometers if you just traveled an hour and a half. So I'm just trying to give some context in terms of what our new council looks like for us to consider. And so once that's sort of, I've given that background, I think I would say that, I'd be very comfortable with a minimum or a number associated with 50% of the time attending in person versus 50% by Zoom. And obviously many of us will try and be in person as much as we can. So I wanted to comment on that in-person aspect and hybrid aspect. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Councillor Hazelton.
I think it's in the Municipal Act that we are only allowed to miss 3 meetings before we're terminated. So I'm not sure that we need any language to reflect that. Somewhat redundant. And I do not believe that there needs to be any predefined constraints in here. I think that if in-person meetings are productive and there are opportunities for what you could refer to as water cooler chats that bring value, then people will be here. But I think we have seen over the last couple of years that Zoom meetings are also very productive. In fact, those of us who have multi-screen technologies perhaps are even more productive in a Zoom environment than in a physical environment. And so I just think that, I heard the comment a couple of times, we're adults. So I think that there doesn't need to be a constraint defined here. I think we should just leave it silent.
All right, thank you. Councilor Graziano.
Thank you, Your Worship. Allow me to preface this by saying that, we had a discussion around the effectiveness of online meetings from a performance standpoint amongst each other recently, and I want to reiterate that for a moment. If we really kind of peel this back, as elected officials, we have a responsibility to our constituents to work on their behalf. And whether that work comes through a format of being online or whether that work comes by way of us being physically present, we're still here. We're still investing the time that we need to invest in order to ensure that our constituents' voices are heard and that we are actively doing what we need to represent them effectively. So with that being said, I personally feel that the 50% rule that was suggested by our staff is a strong rule, and I think we all, as we've all discussed before, will likely do or endeavor to be here as much as possible. But we can or we are confronted from time to time with ad hoc meetings that show up on our calendar, and it just makes it easier for us to be able to be online. So with that said, I'd be agreeable to 50%.
Thank you, Councilor Jarvis, and then we'll get Councilor Predko.
Councilor Graziano took the words out of my mouth. I'm quite happy with the 50%, though I was questioning it earlier on, apropos of Councilor Hazelton's comments and Councilor Bochek's comments about us being reasonable individuals, but we can't guarantee that everybody on council will always be reasonable or have good common sense. I think the guidelines could have in place. And I think, obviously, I think we will all endeavor to be here as much as possible in person. We do tend to, as has been suggested, talk with other people that are members of staff, and face to face with other councilors is always a good thing to do. So I'm happy with the proposal as it stands.
Thank you, Councilor Predko.
And so Councillor Jarvis pretty much took the words right out of my mouth. I think we're all saying the same thing as we go through. The only other two items of clarification that I would like us to make is, at least when we're talking about council and council meetings, is that we're talking about specifically council meetings and not planning council meetings or committee of the whole. Because if somebody is ill one week and they're not able to Zoom or attend, they would have missed 3 meetings potentially in a row, or maybe 4, depending on the schedule, and they would be brought to the principal's office.
Please. Do we have a principal, or is that Karen?
That's Karen. Okay. And then so if we could clarify, we are talking about specifically council meetings, or if we would need to change the language somewhat, if it was to be more generally for any meeting that was the council was brought to. And then secondly, recognizing we're not all full-time residents. Some of us do travel in the winter from the city, and while we would like to be in person, I think all of us would like to be in person at these meetings. If there was a bad weather event, it would be helpful if the township was able to negotiate a preferable rate with a local hotel or some other place of accommodation where we could stay and then not have to worry about the drive on the timeline the council meetings. And that would be the only other ask. I don't think we would be asking for council or for the township to pay our night's accommodation, but to help facilitate a favorable rate to that end.
Ms. Way, you wanted to respond to, as the principal, I believe.
So the way the act is worded, it would be 3 consecutive council meetings, 3 consecutive planning council or COW, not necessarily as much as we schedule them all kind of in a 2-day span. So that's fine. My other recommendation would be if we go with the 50% approach, if we noted that it's 50% of the regularly scheduled meetings, I think that might be important because our ad hoc or special council meetings, like the one we have scheduled at the end of this month, wasn't part of the original plan. It makes it hard to maneuver around, and that meeting itself is designed to be a hybrid meeting, right? Or a remote meeting more. So I'm just wondering, that way we're not halfway through the year and, we were supposed to have 10 meetings up into that point, and all of a sudden we've now had 15 meetings for some reason, and then that'll make the calculations constantly an ongoing back and forth thing versus we can say at the beginning of the year there's 12 meetings or 20, whatever the case is, right? I'm just.
Well, and that leads up to my point is I thought that when we talked about having to attend up to 50%, being allowed to attend up to 50% of council meetings remotely, that would only be the council meetings that have been called, let me call it in person or hybrid meetings, because I think, and my experience, and I've had this discussion, by the way, with the people over at district. I'm a chair of one of the committees, and I've made it clear to them that in some cases I'm going to call a remote meeting, not an in-person meeting, because to the point of travel, I don't want to travel an hour to a meeting that lasts 20 minutes. It's not worth it. It's not worth it environmentally. It's not worth it from a financial point of view or time point of view. And so I would suggest that I like the 50% rule, but with the additional proviso that be allowed to attend up to 50% of, if you want to call them regularly scheduled council meetings or in-person council meeting, something like that, so that if we all of a sudden call 3 remote meetings, that doesn't count count towards that thing. That'd be my only thought there. Councilor Jarvis, your hand's still up, or is that okay? And Councilor Cooper, and Councilor Bochek want to make additional remarks. Councilor Cooper, followed by Councilor Bochek, please.
Just from a practical perspective, I really liked what Councillor Predko had to say about let's the old KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, and use council as the measurable, because we're going to have a terrible job, and our staff would have a terrible job at tracking who's attended and who hasn't, and it would be a huge job. So my suggestion is that if we use the 50%, which I think is fine, it apply to council meetings only, because I remind us all that we have council meetings, we have COW, we have planning council, we have special council meetings, we have committee meetings, we have orientation meetings. The tracking would be insane. So I think apply it to council, and the rest of the time we're going to try and attend if we possibly can in person. So I'm just trying to keep it very simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Bochek.
Thank you. And I think we all know that our constituents like to see our faces in the council's room when they're attending, when they're supporting an application or whatever. It's kind of nice to have your councillor sitting present. At this time, Mr. Mayor, we're only talking about attendance. We're not talking about remuneration and the other things you brought up at you prefaced.
That's coming.
Okay. All right. So I would agree that the 50% rule is just a safeguard. It's just sitting there in case it ever needs to get used. It will never, ever be used. We know that. We're all pretty diligent at attending the meetings. And for somebody to miss, I don't know, a dozen or 2 meetings, I think would be extraordinary. So if you want to put the 50% rule into place, I don't think there's any reason all council couldn't comply to that. That's for sure.
All right. With that, Oh, sorry, Councillor Hazelton.
So I'm interested in understanding the implications of this. So we have the words "be allowed." I'm not quite sure what that really means. I'm not sure what the corrective action might be if you don't do what you're allowed. And I also have picked up on the thread here of the burden on staff to track and monitor, etc. So I'm wondering, rather than having language that says be allowed to attend 50%, rather put it in, let's say, what we're dealing with here is focusing on attendance in person as opposed to attendance in remote. So rather than putting it in a focus on the meetings remotely, that we have the expectation is that council will attend 50% of the meetings in person. Expectation, because if we have this allowed concept, then we have to have a punishment concept. And then we have all kinds of definitions that have to go along with that. And then we have to have staff time to monitor. And then we have to have some authority that allows us to go through a punishment process. And I'm just thinking that that's a whole big process that we probably don't want to go. So that a path we don't want to go down. So I think that that it be a recommendation that council attend 50% of the meetings in person. Thank you.
Ms. Wade.
Sorry, those bullet points were meant to be a summary of the recommendations and not the specific wording that would necessarily be included within the procedural bylaw. So I don't want us to get hung up. I understand what you're saying. That wasn't the specific wording that I was going to 100% say, just to get the point across. Like the resolution says impose in-person attendance. So this still needs to be crafted to be worked into the procedural bylaw once I have more clear direction. So.
Well, and you know, of course, what Councillor Hazelton is pointing out also begs the question. I mean, as you put in your report at one point, remote attendance more than 50% of the time will be deemed the equivalent of an unapproved absence, and the member will not be permitted to participate. So what you're suggesting is if we deemed that Councillor Hazelton has been absent, quote unquote, or been remote more than 50% of the time at a certain stage of the coming term, then in theory, you're suggesting you would say, well, the next meeting he can't participate.
Or can't participate remotely, perhaps.
Well, I mean, and I personally think that Councillor Hazelton is bringing up a point. You know, we can set expectations, but then do we want to start enforcing? And in my mind, our residents have expectations on us, and they're more important than anything else. And they expect our residents expect us to participate in as many meetings as possible. And I'm going to add in one way or another. And I don't think our residents would be terribly pleased if we will go to one or two of our councillors and say, we don't want you to participate in the next meeting because you participated in the past, but remotely. I don't think we want to go there. I think where we do want to go, because the provincial law says that you haven't participated in any form whatsoever for 3 or 4 meetings. We're saying, like, seriously, do you want to be a councillor? And that's a legitimate question at that point. And there may be a perfectly logical explanation, like a health issue or something, that council can take into consideration. So I'm finding myself actually leaning in, I'm going to call it Councillor Hazelton direction at this point, which is we can set an expectation without building in penalties. Yeah. Great. And I think that's where Councillor Vocek was going originally with his comments, is, you know, let's set an expectation and let's not spend a lot of time talking about appropriate penalties, because we don't want to go. We don't even want to get there. That's my thought. So I'm going to tentatively say, you know, we'll have a procedural bylaw that sets an expectation of attendance of 50% in person. and then we'll just leave it at that. I'm seeing nodding heads, so let's go on to the next one, which is the IT stipend. And for everybody's sake, but also for our audience who might be watching this, at this point, well, let me get past term, everybody got $1,692 per term.
No. Non-district.
Okay, but
yeah.
you didn't let me finish.
Okay.
All of us got last term $1,692 as a stipend to cover our costs. 3 of us got it from district, and 4 of us got it from the township.
Yeah.
And in addition, all of us got $600 from the township every year to cover our, let me call it operating expenses. For our whether it's for our phone or for our computer or our internet connection or what have you. That's where it currently is at, so that we get almost, for argument's sake, I'm rounding up, $1,700 a term for our equipment and $600 a year for our running expenses. That's the starting point. So the question now in front of council is, should that be changed? To the best of my knowledge, I don't think district is changing their policy in any significant way. So to the best of my knowledge, the 3 district councillors will be receiving roughly $1,700 shortly for their equipment going forward from the district. Council, I got lots of hands here, so I'll take them in the order they're on my screen. So I'll start with Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you, Mayor, and I just have a couple of quick comments. I want to hear what some of the other councillors say with respect to whether there should be any change or not. I'm not sure it's really needed, but I think it's important to note that a number of us, the majority of us, especially the new council, are really required to maintain 2 offices, not 1. Remotely, I'm talking about now. We don't get an office at the administration building in Port Severn, so we have to maintain offices at our seasonal residence and our winter residence, I'll call it. And associated with those locations can be some pretty high costs pertaining to especially buying data and so on our cell phones, coming in through our cell phones, etc., to attend remotely if we can. And so there are some significant costs maintaining 2 offices for what is supposed to be not a full-time role. So it's kind of an interesting situation that we're in. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Graziano.
Thank you, Your Worship. From my perspective, in reviewing and being a new first-time councillor, I've looked at the costs associated with maintaining my connectability, and I don't feel that the laptop is really the major cost factor when considering the stipends that we received. I did give it some thought, and as perhaps a potential cost-cutting measure, which may see some costs at the onset, but inevitably over time we could review the stipends that we receive. I would strongly recommend that council as well as staff consider issuing township cell phones for 2 reasons. One, perhaps we can leverage economies of scale by way of negotiating a favorable rate through one of the cell phone providers, such as Rogers or Bell or whoever offers us the best rates. And 2, for freedom of information requests, if in the event that we have to submit our devices for an FOI request, we can just proceed to provide them the township issued cell phone rather than having to offer up our personal devices. So similar to why we have laptops, I would strongly recommend we consider cell phones, but I would recommend that we maintain the current stipends based on costs of data, bandwidth, and everything increasing. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jarvis, please.
Yeah, actually, you partially answered my question when I was asking about the stipend that was previously provided by district. And if that's still in place, I think just to equalize things, it'd be good to have that across the board. Other than that, I mean, being furnished with a computer is helpful. I'm not sure that being furnished with a phone would be something I'd be keen on. That we all have personal preferences in what phones and services we use. Computers, to me, not so much. But yeah, that you did partially answer the question, and I would be keen on maintaining that same level of remuneration from the standpoint of IT. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Bocheck, please.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think our expenses are getting any lower when it comes to connectivity, and data charges are starting to become an issue. Living in the area that I live in, you have two choices, really. You can jump onto Bell or Rogers. You get 25 gigs, and then when you go over that, they hit you with $100 overage fee. The other way is Starlink, and we all know what the cost of Starlink is. We're heading that way only because we cannot get the speeds we need, and with Starlink, we're going to be experiencing a lot more cost in the household. And the reason that our data gets driven up beyond the 25 gig is because of digital meetings and things like that. So I think, you know, we were given a laptop with everything that goes along with it, which is great. The district is going to pay me an amount that I can put towards my data fees and that kind of stuff. And I don't think there's any reason why a local councillor would not receive the same amount from a different source, because we're all experiencing the same cost factors. So whatever district is giving to the 3 district councillors, I believe the township should offer to the other 4 councillors. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hazelton.
Thank you. Start off with by saying that the numbers that we're seeing here, I'm not going to suggest that they are that we should increase them because we're in a budget crisis. But I will say that some of the assumptions made here, I would highly disagree with. Computers these days generally are cheap. You can buy a really good computer for doing the things that you need to do here at the township for, I don't know, $500 or $600. Contrast that with a current technology cell phone. Yeah, you buy it on a plan, but the phones are like $1,000 or more. And so that once per term cost is really more likely to cover the cost of a new phone, and new phones well, very few people make their cell phones, smartphones last more than 3 or 4 years. And so I would look at that that first number as you know, that's a cell phone for 4 years, and hope that you don't, you know, smash it or drop it in the water, so you can keep using it. And then if we look at the other annual number, you know, to the comments we've already heard, internet costs alone in one location, let's rough them out at $100 a month. So we got $1,200 a year in one location, plus $1,200 a year in a second location. And even if you're using it or needing it for 50% for township business, that's way over those numbers. So I look at those numbers as being chump change compared to our costs. And I don't think that we should be entertaining the idea of reducing those numbers in any way, shape, or form. And just one final comment with respect to phones and vendors of networks. In my location right now, I have a Rogers phone, but Bell and TELUS have a much better network coverage. But Rogers is putting in a new tower, and so Rogers is going to likely have better coverage for me at my summer location than Bell TELUS. So now we're back to well, what network do you go with? And do the people at the township really want to play around with picking a vendor and figuring out what the coverage is for each individual location? I doubt it. I think that that's a decision that we as councillors have to wrestle with and live with. And so I think that further points to the fact that in my case anyways, I would not be in favor of a township issued phone And I've said enough. Thanks. Bye.
Councillor Fredco.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would agree with many of the comments that have been made so far. I think Councillor Bocek's comment on sort of a parity with the district makes a certain amount of sense. We do have the same requirements as district councillor in terms of our technology and our connectivity. I did originally think, well, you know, $16.95 is probably close to the price of a good laptop, and that's what they provided us, and that would balance out. But I do think that some of our ongoing expenses for technology, you know, as people are mentioning, the cost of cell phone service, data plan, and internet in this region is not cheap. And whether it's Starlink or whether it's ExploreNet that you're trying to use for your internet connectivity here, it's running in approximately $150 a month. So, you know, if we're splitting that, it's $75. And if you move that over the year, we're already over $600 what's being suggested. So I'm not saying that I think the $600 is unreasonable, but I think it's a you know, a reasonable place for us to start. And again, as Councillor Hazelton was commenting on the cell coverage in this region, I understand where Councillor Graziano is coming from with wanting us to have a device that is not personal for FOI type investigations, but I do think it would be challenging for the township to be able to provide people with service at their location. And I know on Go Home Lake in particular, certain areas of the lake, Rogers works, and certain areas of the lakes, Bell and Talus work. So it would be a challenge and extra effort and management for the township, which I'm not sure provides a value that outweighs the benefits of the FOI sort of separation of devices. So having said that, I think the simplest and most accountable, maybe not most accountable, but explainable decision is to piggyback on the district.
Thank you. My thoughts are that I'm hearing a lot of status quo, and I'm more or less in the status quo park myself. As far as I mean, township issued a laptop to each of us. I'm still not fully adjusted to the fact that I'm carrying around 2 computers now instead of 1. It's a bit of a pain, even though I understand why the township did it. Doesn't mean I have to like it, but I'm going to live with that. I think if the township were to issue phones, it's going to add up to the complications. As you know, many of us know, the signal strength in cottage country is variable, if I can be kind. You know, when you have to walk out your front door if you're using one phone, and walk out your back door if you're using the other phone, and at the same time apologize to whoever's called you, we may get cut off if that branch waves in the wind, is a challenge. You know, back in the days when I worked in the private sector, all of my IT costs were covered, and that was a benefit. It was a benefit because even though I did a lot of business from home, all my personal costs were covered too. But that, I don't think as a counselor, we're in that same league. I accept that. For me, whether I'm working, whether I'm have my current position or I fail to be unacclaimed in the past election, my costs weren't going to change because I have an internet service at home. I have an internet service at the cottage, which is nowhere near matches what I have at home for obvious reasons. But I'm going to have them whether I'm working here or not. So to me, whatever we decide, I just consider it in a sense like my salary. I'm getting paid this to do the job. I don't expect it to cover all my costs, but I can also tell you that my costs of internet at home and at the cottage are used by the entire family. It's used at least as much, if not more, for personal versus business. So I'm personally happy with the status quo. Not keen on going to the phones unless the township can make a really effective argument around security, and then I'll carry around 2 phones and go through that headache. So if we want to go for a second round of comments, we can, but I think we're headed to status quo. Councilor Graziano, followed by Councilor Cooper.
Thank you, Worship, and I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So there's a couple of factors with regards to the cell phone, and I'll tie this all in the end.
We're
One,
going to be brief.
One is, as we know, with cell phones, we don't pay for the actual device nowadays with contracts, and terms tend to be 3 to 4 years anyways. And as such, you know, when we do renew with the contract, we then can update the phone with it. So even with you know, the device no longer being actually up to date, we can update it at no cost. Suffice it again that we're renewing, and when we renew, the idea here is that even if I or any one of our members of council here are not elected in the next term, that phone number and that device can then be passed over to the successor, and that phone number is maintained as static. So your Ward 3 councillor would have a statically defined number. Councillor Hazelton made, I think, a compelling point in that he said, you know, I don't want to have a second device and risk smashing it or dropping it in the water. Well, my device is $1,000 device, actually $1,500. And if I smash mine in the line of duty, if you want to call it that, or drop it in the water as I'm visiting a constituent, do I have the right to claim that through council as a lost expense to me because it was in, if for lack of a better term, in a line of duty? Or is it borne out of my own pocket that I have to then go ahead and replace that device myself? As for coverage issues, we have that regardless of whether or not we're on a council device or whether or not we have that on our personal devices. You know, as Councillor Predko stated, you know, even on his lake, if you're on a Rogers phone, which he may likely be, the certain sections of the lake he won't be able to get, you know, connectivity to or reception. And the same is on my lake. I'm with Rogers, and in some areas it's Bell, and vice versa. So we're going to have that regardless of whether or not we have our own devices or not. Some sections of our areas or our coverage is not going to cover even on our personal devices. And so with that being said, I don't think that it would be fair to see that council, that staff be guarantors on our device, you know, reception and the strength of the reception that we're getting. However, alas, you know, it sounds to me that the appetite within council is not that they want to have a second device being held, and I respect my fellow councillors. Although if we look at other municipalities, they are going in that direction. I know that Severn does issue laptops as well as phones to all of its councillors as well as the mayor. But with that being said, perhaps staff can provide us with mitigation strategies on how we don't have to actually provide our cell phones if in the event that there's an FOI request, or how to separate council from our personal devices so we don't have to register them if in the event that there's an issue. And perhaps we can look at a cost associated with the replacement value if in the event that we do render our devices you know, broken while we're out working with constituents. So just my 2 thoughts.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
I don't want to repeat anything I've already said, but just a few key points. One that just came up now, which is FOI access. I'm not making my phone available to anybody because I use my cell phone with my email address, not my township of Georgian Bay email address. And that's how I don't have to do any FOI. I don't have anything to hide, but I have had developers in our area come after some of my emails, and I went in front of the MFIPA people and they said, no, you don't have to provide that information, just for everybody else's information. You don't need that nuisance, and that's one of the ways to get around it. In terms of staying where we are in terms of the amounts, et cetera, that sounds fine to me. It's my understanding, did we not say at the outset of this that the district reimburses some of our expense versus what happens at the township, but are the amounts not equal at the moment?
At this point, the township pays the ward councilors the same amount that the district councilors receive from the district.
Right,
So-
but there's been questions about going to the district amount and where in fact it's apples for apples. Is that not correct?
Yeah, the only thing we'll have to get confirmed is what the amount the district, whether or not the district modifies their amount.
Right, so it is, everybody's being covered off in the same way. So I just wanted, that was my understanding and always has been my understanding. And, you know, I understand that some families like yours, Mayor, may use all of the various systems for themselves and their own purposes. For me, most of my desire to be anywhere near a cell phone or a computer is township related 90% of the time, 95% of the time. The rest of the time, I'm happy to be divorced from those devices. So I just wanted to comment on that because they can take you over. I guess I would prefer to maintain what we've got, and I want to retain my relationship with my cell phone provider. Final point, Starlink is lovely. It ain't going to be available on Georgian Bay in a rural area where I am for a long time. That's what I understand from Starlink and others that have been trying to get it. Just about impossible. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Jarvis, please.
Yeah, I just want to go back to something that I was aware of when I first ran for council. That was that the remuneration was going to be minimal to begin with. And I had no expectations of receiving any kind of compensation for travel or for technology at that time. So I was pleasantly surprised when we introduced the remuneration for technology. This argument will go also with the travel expenses that we're going to be talking about, but the job is not full-time. It is, and the travel certainly is definitely not full-time. And I think we got to keep that in mind. As I said, when I came onto this job, there was not the expectation that I would be compensated fully for all my expenses at that time. And certainly, as I said, I was pleasantly surprised with the IT remuneration when it came through, and happy with just continuing as is.
Thank you. Councilor Credco.
And thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to make just a very brief comment, and it was brought up by Councillor Graziano about dropping his cell phone, whether it's personal or work. I just wanted to remind staff that we should have a policy for loss liability on our laptops, so that we know where the responsibility lies if something happens to our laptop.
Thank you. So I think I can, oh, sorry, Councilor Bochek.
Technical error, the hand shouldn't be up.
Okay. I think I could conclude that our IT discussion is basically status quo. So now we'll go on to council remuneration, and more specifically, the meeting allowance. And I think, as it was pointed out, is that we all receive meeting allowances, which is basically a percentage of our salary. And that is, I mean, I don't know, speaking strictly for myself, when I get my pay stub every month, there's two pieces to it. And I never worry about one piece versus another. I just look at the total and what goes into the bank. But the way it is now set out, and I think this is partly, you know, historically, and when I say historically, I think it was the change was made 5 years ago or so. Historically, any salary received by municipally elected officials, 1/3 was considered tax-free. And that was considered tax-free in that that was supposed to be a way of being compensated for the expenses you were incurring. And then the federal government changed those laws a number of years ago, so that now our pay is considered fully taxable, just like anybody else's pay. But we have it nonetheless in our pay stubs, the distinction between with, you know, a certain portion of ours is considered meeting allowance and the rest is considered salary. Ms. Way, you wanted to comment to that?
Yes, and the meeting allowance is to cover your time for each individual meeting, but it's also all encompassing for mileage at this point in time. So you're not submitting monthly sheets saying I traveled, you know, 10 miles to get here, or by car, by boat, etc., or that 1 kilometer past the township line once you get, you know, to the office. So it's easier to administer from a staff perspective, but it may not be an equal compensation perhaps, and that's kind of where this conversation is going.
Well, yeah, and just for everyone's information, for instance, at district, they do provide mileage for district counselors. When you attend a meeting in person, they provided nothing when you did not, but their district mileage policy is from your Muskoka address. So any of us who live outside of Muskoka part of the year, we were being paid mileage from our Muskoka address only. That's their policy. So they do pay individuals mileage to get to their scheduled meetings, not for any, I'll call it extracurricular meetings or anything else, other than they and the township here will pay costs if you're going to an approved conference or other such type thing, which I mean, I think that our council very rarely collects on that. So that's the background. Councilor Hazelton, we'll start this round with you, please.
Thank you. There is I think a need to understand the history of our township and understand where we are today with respect to that. And so in a very narrow point of discussion, if we roll back the clock a few terms, most of the members of council were permanent residents that lived here, and their commute to and from the office was, call it, negligible. And now we're sitting with a situation where 6 of the 7 members are essentially remote. Many of us have, or all of us have properties here, but we also spend much of our time remote. And I think that dynamic is, and that demographic is important to understand as we consider a change. The second thing I wanted to highlight is, as we look at the members of council, we have 1 member of council who is currently actively employed, and the rest of us are essentially retired. And if we were to go to AMO and ask them what's it like getting people to volunteer for council and do the job, they would suggest that we have a serious problem in Ontario where we have too many gray hairs and not enough younger people. And so when we think about the concept of council remuneration, I think we need to be also cognizant of the term successor planning. In other words, how are we going to encourage more people of a younger age to step up and do this job so that the gray hairs can step aside and actually retire, or the no hairs, sorry, the gray hairs and the no hairs. So with that said, I wanted to pick up on what our clerk commented on a moment ago, which I think is a key characteristic of what we need to be doing as we go forward. If we make a change, I think it has to be a change that requires no administrative impact. So in the context of a meeting allowance, let's assume that that meeting allowance is there for the old game of counselors who are physically in the geography. The new game might be different, but maybe we need to find a way to pad that number with a reflection of travel expense that allows people getting to and from the township offices. And I actually I tend to play a lot with Excel, and so I decided to go and make myself a little model. And in that model, what I did was I said, well, you know, what's the distance from my winter residence to the township office? And what's my distance from my summer residence to the township office from the marina? And what's the distance from the marina to my summer residence? And then I factored in target, you know, sample, you know, cost per kilometer and how many trips, etc. And I did this both for me, and I took the liberty of doing it for Councillor Cooper, because I know where his cottage is and where his house is. And I just wanted to throw out there that for me, the number actually, if I target to attend 50% of the meetings in person, then my cost would be $867 a year. Mr. Cooper, Councillor Cooper, his cost would be $1,284 a year. Excuse me. My point in this ramble is, if we were to take a simple model like this, and if we were to provide each of us as councillors an example of the model, and they could plug in, you know, their distances and everything else, we could come up with numbers that were specific to each councillor based on this assumption of target assumption of attending 50% of the meetings. And then each of us would have a number that staff could pad onto the meeting allowance. And so it would not be something that anybody has to claim mileage and all that other stuff. In my case, I'm very happy to have, you know, any one of the councillors put in their numbers and just have their unique number added into the package. And you could do this once a year or once a term or whatever. And then no effort for staff to monitor and manage this. No effort from councillors to track and, you know, report and go through expense tracking, etc. And it just makes the whole concept very simple, but it also puts in place a model for future councillors as we think about successor planning, so that, let's say we have somebody who lives in Mississauga or Kitchener, Waterloo, and we're asking them to come in on a regular basis or a periodic basis. We have a model that allows them to see, I could have my costs covered, and so it's not going to be a financial burden. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to reduce the financial burden of being here and present and doing the job. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. I think we need to keep it simple, stupid, and you know, KISS method again. And so a monthly or annual allowance makes a lot of sense. I think it needs to be, as Councillor Hazelton pointed out, customized to what is the reality for each one of us in a reasonable way. And so I think we need to figure that out. And by the way, there is some information available to us also as to how the district tracks things. For example, at my request, the district came up with a figure for traveling over the water, and it was based on information that they got from British Columbia, of all places, where councillors were traveling by water. And in my case, it's quite a distance, and often in a large boat. That so $3 a kilometer, not 50 cents a kilometer. So that was something that's useful and customized, and I thought I'd mention that. And you know, with respect to CRA, you know, they're taxing us like we were employees. Technically, though, just mention this, it's been found in the courts, we are not technically employees. We are independents, and that's the way I plan to keep it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bochek.
Thank you. And thankfully, this is at COW, so we can have a little bit of an open conversation about this. And Mr. Hazelton, I don't like your formula, because I think I would get about 18 cents a month, living only about 400 yards away from the building.
You could use Arizona.
Yeah. My understanding was that, and over the, you know, the time I've been on council, there was a change where 1/3 of our compensation was tax-free. Because really it's not income, it's covering expenses, and that was taken away from us. And when you look at what we're being compensated for, it's not an income for a job we're doing, it's to help to cover our expenses, to get up the river and to get out to places and view things and take part as a counselor. And also my understanding that there was a meeting allowance that we were given, not a travel allowance. And we're making this conversation here about travel. And to explain the meeting allowance, the way I understood it, when I was gainfully employed, I would say be stationed in Wingham or Stayner or wherever doing my career, and then I'd have to come to council, and I would get an amount for showing up and attending the council meeting. That's was my understanding of it, and that travel was not really a part of that meeting expense. Could be completely wrong, but I think the meeting expense covers you attending the meetings, and the other amount you're compensated for is getting out and speaking to constituents and doing your job as a counselor. So I think the status quo right now works, and if you want to entertain adding something to that for travel, I think that would be the appropriate method, but that's just my feelings, and I'll let others speak on it. Oh, and I did want to mention one other thing that probably most people don't realize, that whether you're gainfully employed like Christian is, or have a career, and the rest of us are retired, we still have income. And that is added, and this amount that we're being compensated, for me, it gets cut by 40%. Because I'm in that tax bracket, and the amount that I'm being paid is added to my income, and then it puts me in a position where I lose about, I don't know, 35 or 40% to taxes off this amount. So if there's anything we can do to make it an expense payment instead of an income, I don't know if that's feasible, but the tax burden is what seems to affect myself and probably most of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking at the three counselors beside me who haven't spoken, and whether any of them want to speak to this matter before I do. Okay, I don't see hands raised. Oh, Councillor Petco, you got your mic on anyway.
I'm trying to decide, but I don't have anything more valuable to add, so I'll be quiet.
I have a few thoughts. I thought it was interesting when Councillor Hazelton went on the succession planning type of discussion. And I think that I don't want to walk down that path too far, because if we want to look at getting younger people on this council, or even on some of our community committees, then we're also talking about time of day. I've met numerous people who say they're not going to want to be a counselor because council meets during the day. Oh, and by the way, the meetings are far too long, which I happen to agree with them. So it's hard to take somebody who has a full-time job, presuming they have semi-regular, what used to be the considered regular hours, Monday to Friday. They may not be joining council because of the hours of our meetings, and that is, to me, that's probably a more significant factor than whether or not we pay them any form of travel allowance. To me, and I see Ms. Boutiette's come on screen, so she'll probably throw some tax perspective at us. But to me, if what I get is taxable, I don't care what you call it. I don't care if you call it mileage. I don't care if you call it meeting allowance. I don't care if you call it food allowance or salary or compensation, or I don't care what you call it. If it's taxable, it's taxable. And my understanding of, and I consider myself an employee. I mean, I think technically I am an employee, unlike the rest, but I can't make any tax deductions for my travel from my home, wherever it is on any given day, to office, because CRA said that's not a deductible expense. Now, travel I go to other places, I can use that and offset the allowance that I'm if I got an allowance for that. But so I'm less concerned about what we call it. I am a little bit concerned that if we take the notion of paying people more the farther their winter home, and in most cases it's a winter home, the farther their winter home is from our office. Then we have somebody like Councillor Bocek, who is, Arizona part of the winter. And shall we pay him to come back and forth from Arizona? Because that'll offset the fact that in the summer, he can walk here, which would be good for your health, of course, Mr. Bocek, if you don't get hit by a car on the way. But so I think we have to be a little bit careful with that. But I'm open to this, but I also think that, I'm in a little bit different position, and I say that because I'm paid more to be a mayor than you are to be a councillor, and I'm paid to be a district councillor. I consider, for me, it's a full-time job, and when I say, but with very irregular hours, I took a significant cut in pay to do this job versus what I was doing before, but I was glad to do it because that stage, I was at that stage of life where with my priorities. So anyway, I think we have to be a little bit careful how we do this, but having said that, I'm open to the discussion continuing, but I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Boutiette to throw some tax thoughts. Oh, she disappeared. Ms. Boutiette, was it something I said?
Through your worship, I think you hit the nail on the head. You covered it. It doesn't really matter what you label it. CRA will deem it as a taxable benefit unless it's the allowable mileage allowance, which CRA sets. And CRA does not set a boat mileage allowance, so that would become a taxable benefit regardless of what you label it. So I just wanted to offer up that, I could try to answer CRA questions, even though I'm not a tax auditor or a tax accountant. And anything that I'm not 100% sure of, I would definitely follow the process of requesting a CRA ruling from the CRA to get answers and directions direct from the source.
Ms. Boutiette, if you don't mind, just to follow up that, I know that when I come to the office, as far as CRA is concerned, I'm going to my place of employment, and therefore no deduction. Is that true for the councillors here who are not, I think, technically an employee of the township? Do you have any idea?
I don't have an idea, but I would definitely, there's a couple questions I was going to pose to CRA recently, so that could definitely be added to my list. So I could get a ruling and report back to council.
All right. So I guess, and we've had a lot of sort of discussion on this, but I guess it comes back to, do we believe that our residents would be happy with the idea of us paying a little more to those councillors whose winter residents, and I'm using that example because for most of us it's the winter residents whose winter residence is outside the township. Because that's what it comes down to. If we want to pay more to people who live farther away in the winter, are our residents open to that concept? And Councillor Hazelton, I'll throw that immediately at you because you started this conversation the first time around. Do you believe that our residents are open to paying? Let's pick an example. We know we have people in our area who live in London or who live in, well, let's pick Montreal. How should they be compensated if they were in a councillor? Because you're talking about going forward in the future.
I am, and the idea of a person being a councillor living in Montreal and attending 50% of the meetings in person is a fail before you start. So that'll never happen. They would attend perhaps the meetings in the summer in person, in which case you're dealing with a different distance dynamic. But I think that when I talk to residents and help them understand the compensation model, I get support from them on the concept of, well, you should have your expenses covered. And if the township is expecting you to come to meetings in the wintertime, yeah, that's an ongoing expense. You know, in addition to the need to be into the territory, you know, the geography of your ward on a regular basis. But I think that you know, generally speaking, I think the residents would be supportive. Would they be supportive if we walk forward with a 28% tax increase? Maybe not, but you know, that's what the budget is telling us we need to do. But in fairness, the numbers that we're talking about compared to the budget increase are trivial. So I don't think that would have a significant negative impact. And I think that I think residents want more people in the community to take more of an interest. And I think this is a potential barrier to entry, if you will.
So, and I appreciate, and I'll get to Councillor Jarvis, and I appreciate your reference to getting back to numbers. If memory serves, you were suggesting, and you gave two examples, yourself and Councillor Cooper, $800 and $1,200 a year, I think was the two, roughly the two figures you would.
Yeah, so I have to declare a conflict of interest.
Yeah, no, okay, but I'm using that because I'm going to say, you know, I think Councillor Jarvis's Toronto address is a little farther south than Councillor Predko, but we would be, I mean, just let me ballpark for a moment, just because I think it's important. Perhaps their allowance would be $1,500 a year, perhaps.
Probably 2,000.
So we're talking about, in a sense, giving a potential of up to $2,000 more per some of our councillors.
And for me, that's when I understand what that is attempting to do, which is to reduce the cost burden of being a representative for the community, then I think it's a reasonable approach. Yeah, and I think that's the way we need to understand it and frame it. This is, you know, quote, it's a volunteer job. Can you do it all remotely? No, you can't. If we're setting expectations of being in person, then we are basically setting in play an expectation that you're going to go spend a whole bunch of your own personal money to get here to do the job. And the costs that Councillor Predko and Councillor Jarvis are going to incur are going to be way more than my costs. So I understand that, and I'm not uncomfortable at all with their expenses being covered to be able to do that. And how we do that, whether we, you know, according to Julie, you can't take the boat side of things and put it in. So just to make it nice and simple, just tag it on to a meeting allowance as an annual number, or you can make it a monthly number. I don't know, whatever you want to do. And anyway, that's.
I'm going to dare throw out an idea, and I'm not saying that this is my vote in favor of it, but what if we debated the feasibility of a travel allowance, or if I'm going to see to separate from the current. You're not touching the current meeting allowance at this point. A travel allowance of based on a calculation like you suggested of a certain distance, but you know, say to a maximum of say 10% of your pay. And I'm saying that because right now the average counselor makes $28,000, so that'd be $2,800 would be the maximum. I mean, again, I'm just for discussion. What we are basically saying to our, and let's presume next election, every single counselor elected would qualify for that full. I mean, worst case scenario would be the remuneration for council would go up 10%. I'm painting it because I think we have to have that, call it the numbers guy. I mean, we have to have that perspective. So now, obviously, many councillors would get a fraction of that, but I think we have to set a maximum, which would also imply that somebody like, and you can tell me, somebody like Councillor Bocek, who might spend 3 or 4 months of his year much farther away, he'd still have a maximum, but he could apply for that maximum, given that he's got to come back. He's got to get on a plane to come back for our meetings each month for 3 or 4 months. Would he qualify for that?
This afternoon, flying this afternoon for the orientation meeting tomorrow.
I don't think it's until Thursday, isn't it?
No, it's tomorrow, but it's.
No, he's thinking of the district one, I think, on Thursday.
Oh, that's right.
Thursday and Friday.
Yeah.
There's two districts.
There's district council training is tomorrow. For Thursday.
Thursday and Friday.
But us is only Friday.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I think we've got,
That's, yeah.
yeah. Anyway, I just throw it out for discussion, and now we're going to Councillor Jarvis, followed by Predco and Graziano, please.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to a comment I made with regards to IT compensation. I made clear at the time that when I was originally looking at running for position on council here, the expectation is that there would be expenses, but the remuneration that we received was minimal to begin with. And that was just a state of affairs. And that was what I was prepared to live with regards to travel, particularly over water, which would be about 6+ meetings a year. Actually 12, actually over 12. So I'm having a hard time dealing with this because I hadn't expected there'd be any remuneration. I really do feel from the standpoint of our constituents, we got to try and keep our costs down. 2 terms, the previous term, I bucked for a no increase in salary. I think some people recall that. And I very much on that end of things, I think we came into this with our eyes open with regards to what our remuneration would be. And if we can't accept that as a status quo, then I think it's unfortunate, but that's the way it is from my standpoint. I think we should be taking what we get so far and do our jobs. Thanks.
Councillor Predco.
Once again, Councillor Jarvis stole my thunder. So I was going to actually say pretty much the same thing that I think when I signed up for this, I knew that the pay was, an honorarium. It's not a salary, and anything that was being provided was going to be modest. And in that vein, I think the meeting allowance is reasonable for what travel I have to do, and in also I think probably what Councillor Jarvis is suggesting. We haven't talked about the honorarium portion of the compensation, but considering where we are this year, I don't think it's unreasonable for us to forego an increase of 2% this year for our honorariums as well. That's kind of how I see things this year.
Thank you. Councillor Graziano, please, followed by Cooper and Bocek.
Thank you, Your Worship. We are directing staff to look at all ways of cutting costs this year in order to try to balance our deficit. And as a result, I think as councillors, we should be leading by example. So in line with Councillor Jarvis and Councillor Predco, I'm not inclined to see any increases at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper, please.
I'd just like to say, first of all, I'm so happy to be back in at this meeting. Sorry for my attendance problem. I had a power outage in Aurora, of all places. Never had one of those before. Virtually none. Anyway, just wanted to say that while I find the sentiments expressed by Councillor Jarvis and others as admirable, it's not about personal. It's about what in my mind, it also has to do with what has been raised by Councillor Hazelton and really got me thinking about this whole process as well, and that is succession, attracting new people to the role of being a counselor, and people shouldn't be out of pocket. I don't think I want to see any increase in my compensation as a counselor honorarium. I view that role as, it's a volunteerism for the most part, but some are traveling significant distances, and the meeting allowance doesn't cover that. So I don't even see that. I think it's reasonable to try and come up with something that is addresses the issue of attracting people and, frankly, remunerating those of us that are here for at least our expenses. And it's very uneven at the moment as to what we get in terms of what our costs are as it pertains to travel. It's very unbalanced, and certainly was in my 2 previous terms, when the majority, in some cases, in the first term of council, were coming locally, and I was traveling long distances, and especially by boat, hugely expensive. So do we want to discourage others from running? I think it does if we don't be realistic about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Vocek, please.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions here, and I think the only one that can answer me is maybe Councillor Cooper, because we were the only ones around, including staff back in the day, that when the federal government changed the rules, and I'm going to use rough figures here, say the honorarium for councillors was $2,000, and 1/3 of that was tax-free. The federal government took that 1/3 tax-free away, and council said, okay, we're not going to take the hit of that. We're going to give us an increase of an amount of the same of what we would have been compensated for and not taxed on. So I think that's where the meeting allowance came into play. It was basically that amount that we were going to be paid that was not deductible anymore. So things have changed. I think that meeting allowance was put into place so that our compensation remained the same. Some people thought it was maybe we gave ourselves a raise, but we didn't. We simply kept the same amount of gross income by doing this, and things have changed. And Councillor Jarvis,
Councillor Vocek, just if you don't mind, quick.
Yes, please.
My recollection was that when that one came in front of council, and I was observing it as opposed to being on council at the time, because it was the end of your first term.
Right.
The goal was that your take-home pay would end up being the same as it was beforehand.
Correct. Thank you for articulating that for me. Councillor Jarvis, to your point, this is a practice that takes place at the beginning of every term, and we're at the beginning of a new term, and we all agreed to the amounts for last term. They were all acceptable. And here we are re-looking at it because it's 4 years later and the economy has changed and things have changed and fuel prices have changed and everything has changed. And perhaps the $600 amount is not the right amount now. So my suggestion would be, if it's not the right amount, we increase that for the meeting allowance. I think it would be an absolute nightmare for staff to try and track seasonable travel, water travel from their place in the city or from their place, or maybe in my case, I choose to live in Port Severn year round. I have a residence in the city. I don't choose to use it. I rent it out. Legally, I guess I could say, well, I'm coming from the city. To me, the travel makes no difference. And I just think the meeting allowance is not sufficient today. It was when we did it 5 years ago, but that's changed a little bit. So if we were to increase that, I think the public would accept it. They know. The conversation I get every time I meet a constituent is, I don't know why you do this. You don't get paid for it. You get nothing. I mean, in the swimming pool yesterday, the guy says, what do you do for a living? And I said, I'm a local counselor. And he says, is that all you do? And I said, yes. And they said, why? why would you do it for so little pay? So I think the public knows that we do this because it's in our hearts to do it. To be compensated for it is great. And to not losing money by doing it is even better. So if we can figure out a way that, you know, through the honorarium and through our meeting expenses, we cover our costs to do what we do, I think that's quite fine. And my recommendation would be to take a look at that $600 that was put in 5 years ago, take the rate of inflation, add it to it, and come up with a new figure that is more suitable for today's environment. And that's pretty much all I have, because I don't travel. You guys do, so I'll leave the travel part up to you.
But I think the $600 was an IT stipend, and we already agreed to leave that at status quo. What we're talking about now is the meeting allowance, which for counselors, if you allow me to round figures, a counselor's salary is roughly $23,000, and their meeting allowance is roughly $5,000 currently.
That's where I kind of drove that $600 from per annum.
No, the $600 per annum is your IT stipend. You are paid roughly $23,000 a year to be a counselor, plus $5,000 a year as a meeting allowance, divided by 12 for each monthly pay, of course.
Right, so that's $500 per month. My figures were off there, but still, I think in a case of a counselor who's living locally and doesn't travel, the status quo is fine. And if we were going to do anything for a local counselor that doesn't travel, is just increase that meeting amount to today's standards instead of what it was 5 years ago. That would be my only recommendation, being self-serving.
And I believe we passed a bylaw, the prior council passed a bylaw back in, was it October, with regards to the remuneration for council in the coming term, did they not?
I think it had to be updated about the CPI rate. So what happened?
Okay. Okay, yeah, I see a head nod. So, yeah, because typically the prior council sets the remuneration for the following council.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
we did that exercise. I remember that. And so travel for me is not an issue. The district is paying for my travel when I travel to district, and locally I don't have any travel, so it doesn't really affect me at all. But the meeting allowance is where I could see an increase would help me. It doesn't really help the other counselors, but it would help me.
Councilor Cooper, you wanted to add an additional thought here?
I just wanted to say that I think Councilor Bochak and the mayor are correct in that there were allowances or adjustments made because of the tax situation. But, and I think it's also been pointed out here that there's a meeting allowance, and I'm maybe it needs to be adjusted for inflation. I don't really think so. I wasn't expecting that. But there is a variable, and that's travel. And I don't think we've made an accounting for that. And I still say, taking the personal side out of it, I think it's an issue related to succession and attracting other people. It's an attraction issue. So I would like to see us do something to make it a little bit more level playing field. Thank you.
Well, may I make a suggestion to council? Because we could go in circles around this, and it seems half the council are open to the idea and half the council are not. But I'm wondering if it makes sense, because I mean, we are a committee of the whole, we're not making final decisions here. If it makes sense for Councillor Hazelton to share his model with staff and have staff do a calculation, what that would mean to each one of us individually, so that when we revisit this in council, we would at least know the dollar amounts we're talking about. Because I think that might make it an easier I'm not saying that that's going to win counselors over. I'm not saying that at all. But then maybe it would keep us, we'd be a little more informed when we make our decision on this when it comes in front of council. So what I'm looking at is based on all this discussion. So we're talking about the procedural bylaw simply setting an expectation for 50% attendance in person. And leaving the IT stipend policy as is or unchanged. And to do further work on the meeting allowance before we make any decision on that, or I'll call it, sorry, travel allowance. Is that more or less where we're at this point, council? I see, yeah, nods. So I'm going to ask our clerk to assist me with the wording that will keep her happy, and then I will read that that motion for consideration. So what we've done is I'm not going to make any reference to the IT stipend because that's going to be status quo. So I have moved by Councillor Hazelton, seconded by Councillor Predko. Be it resolved that the Committee of the Whole recommends the following amendments be made. 1, procedure bylaw set an expectation for 50% attendance in person. And 2, the staff report back on travel allowance options. Councillor Jarvis.
Just in the first part of that, the requirement or the expectation of 50% attendance at what? Might want to clarify that.
Of in-person attendance at regular council meetings.
Thank you.
I mean, anything that Ms. Wade drafts up has to be reviewed by council before it gets approved. So, you know, if we want to wordsmith it, we have. Okay, are anybody ready for the vote? All those in favor? And that is carried. All right. Now we want to talk about Shore Road allowance. Does anybody require a break? I know some of you have taken a break. Does anybody require a break, or should we just keep carrying on? We'll carry on. Okay, so we have a Shore Road allowance fees review, and I believe that's also our clerk's department.
So in December, after some back and forth, we finally approved the Shore Road allowance policy, which updated our fee structure to include the linear pricing versus the per square meter pricing. And this was in an effort to make it consistent and fair when purchasing our Shore Road allowances, because the depths that are above water are often, sometimes they're fluctuating depending on the body of water, and sometimes the water is now covering the original Shore Road or portions thereof. So in order to make this equal moving forward, it's kind of hard to work retroactively, obviously, in these circumstances, but the price per linear meter is based off of the original SRA depth of 66 feet. If we take the current square meter price of $12 per square meter, that would equal to $242 per linear meter at the equivalent of 66-foot depth. This price is kind of in the middle of the other prices across the district for what they charge for their SRAs. This would be a profit at this point in time because legal costs and administrative fee are still paid for, which is not up for debate or isn't part of the conversation today. So I guess really it's up to council to determine what it is we're looking at selling the land for, if we want to sell it for more and this is a revenue source for us, or if we want to do what the archipelago does and just sell it for $2 as a means to just dispose of the land for the frontage for these cottage owners. In 2021, yes, in 2021, we updated the fee, or increased the fee from $8 to $12 per square meter because it was deemed at the time that shore road frontage was more valuable than road allowance frontage, which remained at a price of $8 per square meter. And that obviously will continue to be. So that's how we got to this $12 per square meter, which has led me to the 242, which, I mean, the actual calculation is 241.32, but for ease of math, 242. So I'm looking for direction, staff is looking for direction on where we would like this fee to land.
Councillor Wojcik, please. Followed by Councillor Hazelton.
Two questions, one of clarity and one for information. I'll start with the clarity question. If you're going to do a linear tracking across the shore road allowance, would that take into topographical figures too? In other words, if the property goes up and down and up and down on the shoreline, are we measuring the up and downs, or are we measuring straight line directly across? That would be my first question.
Our intent is to measure via straight line, similar to how we would like to take a calculation the same way planning would take the calculation for frontage. So generally a straight line, we have no intentions of measuring every little dip in and out.
And do you think there would be an argument or an appeal ability for someone to say, well, that's not true, my true lineage, because I have 100-foot peaks and valleys, and if you measure my frontage, including that, then it's far superior. Do you think there's a reason that we're going to get stuck in litigation over that?
I do not, because if we measure it by peaks and valleys, it's going to cost them more money than if we just do the linear line similar to planning's frontage process.
Okay. And my second question for information is, do we have an amount, say for the year 2021, that the township collected from the sales of shore road allowance? And I know this is kind of throwing it in your face.
There was a quarter in the report. They talked about $250,000 in 2022.
In 2022 was $250,000.
Roughly.
Okay. And how do we feel that's going to change if we go to linear instead of square meters?
There'll probably be an increase because not all of those properties had the full 66 feet above water. So as a whole, initially it'll appear that we're selling for more, so to speak, just because we're encapsulating the entire 66 feet now versus before we weren't always. And so there is an inconsistency in that regard, which is why we're going to the linear meter. But as a whole, this will see an increase in revenue.
Thank you.
Depending upon the number of applications.
Yes, yes.
Councillor Hazelton, please.
Thank you. I want to introduce an item that complicates things just a little bit, but is reflective and being sensitive to our community. And I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think our township, we have something like 80% water only access. 50%? I thought that was okay. So let's assume 50% of our residents are water only access. So the need to get to your property means you have to cross your shore road allowance. Any road access property has already resolved any issues of getting from the road to the property. But here we are in a situation where we have been holding our residents hostage by saying you have to buy your shore road allowance or get a license of occupation in order to repair a dock on your shore road allowance. And I think what is interesting is if I like what the clerk has done here in providing comparable numbers as we look up and down the shore, because in the township of the archipelago, where almost everybody has a shore road allowance, that is something they have to cross to get to their property because they're predominantly water access. They're charging $2 a square meter. By the way, I love your idea of going to the linear number, so we'll bounce back and forth between the two numbers. But I think what the archipelago, can't talk, whatever, TOA have done is reflective and being sensitive to their residents who must access their properties across the Shore Road Allowance. And so I think that there is a very powerful argument for differentiating between a property that is water only access and must access across the Shore Road Allowance versus a property that is not water only access and has other paths to get to it. And so I would suggest that the value of the Shore Road Allowance, the price of the Shore Road Allowance is reflective of these two states. And those people who can drive to their cottage and look at their Shore Road Allowance as a discretionary use, desirable thing versus mandatory requirement to get access to their property, I think those are two very critical differences. Having said all of that, I went back to my little Excel spreadsheet and I made another model. Anyways, what I was trying to do was figure out if we were to leverage what the archipelago has done, $2 a square meter, rough out to about $40 a linear meter in the new model that you're doing. And what I would like to suggest is that we take a somewhat aggressive approach to letting our community know that for a short period of time, we are going to make it possible for them to buy their Shore Road Allowances, which they probably should have done 20 or 30 years ago. But here's an opportunity to buy your Shore Road Allowance. It's going to be $40 a linear foot, a linear meter. And that's going to be for the entire window of 23 or maybe 23 and 24, whatever. And then we would advertise this in tax notices and social media, etc. And as long as you filed your application by a certain date, perhaps the December of either 23 or 24, that you qualify for that rate. And then we would go back to another rate and whether that's, the old $8 square meter, $12 a square meter, whatever those convert to in linear foot, I think is probably reasonable. But we have held hostage tons of residents who didn't know they needed to buy their Shore Road Allowance and should have done something, but we never informed them. Shame on us, shame on them for thinking about it. But let's take a proactive approach. Let's aggressively inform them this is coming. We're going to give you a short window where we're going to give you an opportunity to do what you should have done. And then we're going to go back to, what we'll call current pricing models.
Thank you. Councillor Predko, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess what I've been looking at on this issue is the comparison of in 2022 what our residents that purchased their Shore Road Allowance paid when they were paying by the square meter versus the equivalent of what they would pay if they were buying it by the frontage. So all of those applications that came in and went through council had a survey with the frontage line across the front. And, obviously from Karen's description, the $12 per square meter is pretty much equivalent to $242. And as we look at the individual properties, though, there's a big variety in terms of how this benefits or is a detriment to different people. So as we go forward, I think we need to make sure we're aware that on the average, we're not having an impact, but on individual properties, depending on the shape of their shore, it seems to have a considerable impact, up to 25% of the price of the Shore Road Allowance. I think, from what I'm hearing from Councillor Hazelton, I kind of like the idea of having a Shore Road Allowance sale. I think, the township has said that this is not a strategic asset for the township, but I think there are a number of property owners that hadn't realized that they really needed to own their shore road allowance, and this might be an opportunity for us to gather a lot of sales and try to process a lot of sales in a short period of time, and then move the price back to something that we think is market equivalent to what it was before. My only concern with all of this is that the people who have recently purchased their shore road allowance, they're not going to be very pleased with a decision of council to discount. And I think if we were to have a sale, we would need to have some sort of accommodation to provide some sort of relief to the people who most recently purchased their short road allowance.
I don't know how we can provide a discount retroactively on land that has been sold. Historically, what we do is the price that is set when the application is submitted, that's the price that they pay. So perhaps a little bit of a give and take would be to anyone who hasn't closed, or like the application hasn't been approved, but we have it waiting to go, then we would honor the lower price as it comes forward in that time frame, as well as anyone who maybe applies in that time frame moving forward. That might be, it doesn't provide a discount for everyone who's purchased in the past 12 months, but it would at least those who applied in December, for example. I don't know if there's anyone, but if someone had applied in December and it'll be coming forward to council for approval in the spring, that we could honor the discounted rate as opposed to the $12.
Councillor Jarvis, please.
A point of clarification here for all our benefits. If I recall correctly, an SRA usually is on property that is mainland, not island. No?
Many islands don't have shore road allowances, but some do.
Yeah, I know in my experience in Cognizine, we have not had a lot of properties, and we've had the odd property. It's usually been the exception to the rule. That is SRA, has SRA. Certainly my property, our island does not. I'm wondering, I look at the archipelago with a $2 flat rate, but how many properties are actually affected and have to buy SRAs in the archipelago? I mean, where's the bottom line on the archipelago's cost? Would our CAO have any idea based on his experience with the archipelago?
No, off the top of my head, I know since COVID, there has been an uptick in applications.
Okay.
Quantity wise, I'm not sure. I do recall the person involved in dealing with the short allowance process, taking that person a fair bit of time to go through each application. So that there was a jump.
Okay. I mean, initially I think the idea of going with the linear meterage makes a significant amount of sense. It's just easier to do the calculation. You have to worry about certainly water level adjustments in the Georgian Bay proper. So that makes a lot of sense. I certainly am, I like Councillor Hazelton's idea of reducing what it costs for people to purchase SRAs when they have really no other way of getting to their property. And there's an issue there. I mean, you're almost forcing their hand. I don't know about the sale. The problem there is people that have purchased previously are going to be lining up at the door, just screaming and yelling at us. So I have an issue with that. I'm not sure what the resolution is on that, but I do like the idea of going with linear footage. We just looked at it straight from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you, and a lot of good points raised. This there are a number of issues, and it's a bit of a thorny issue, the shore road allowance, because I do take it. I find it very concerning that we would force anybody to buy a shore road allowance who is their only way of accessing their property is by water. So to Councillor Hazelton's point, and I don't know that they need to be forced to buy their shore road allowance. at all, unless they're putting a structure in the shore road allowance. A dock is an access point. It's like a driveway. And so I think that we're sometimes throwing in certain criteria that are not necessary at all. And so I think that's the case. I like the linear idea, but I think the fee is too high. I'm not sure about a sale. I think maybe we're just, our fee is very high. I would also remind us that, yes, there are a few islands on the inland lakes that for some strange reason have shore road allowance, but generally speaking in our township, and I've gone through GeoHub and looked at everything, every island, and 90% of them do not have shore road allowance. So that's been what I've seen out there. And whether it's island or just water access mainland, the mainland, for whatever reason, has shore road allowance. And I think we need to treat everybody equally in terms of the requirements that we make of them. Put a building into the shore road allowance, buy it. But requiring a purchase otherwise is out of line as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Ms. White.
We don't force people to buy their shore road. That's why we have the license of occupation, but it's only provided in a replacement dock for water access only properties. We don't allow them to build or expand upon what is pre-existing. I know Councillor Cooper just suggested treating everyone equally, but also to that point, I'm trying to find maybe a happy compromise. I don't know. If we have two classes of fees, one for water access only properties and one for properties that have road access but are looking to purchase their waterfront. I don't know if that's somewhere in the middle of a sale versus making it accessible for people who have water access only to purchase.
Councillor Graziano.
Thank you, for your worship, for recognizing that I haven't spoken yet. Couple of concerns with respect. I see, Councillor Jarvis just took us down, so disregard. With regards to our current fiscal deficit, our clerk today advised that this is a revenue generating service that we provide, and I'm inclined to say that, I think that I would rather see the costs of what I deem to be pay-to-play services increase over a substantial tax gain. So I'm also a water access property, and I don't believe I own my shoreline my shore road allowance. But I would prefer to see our costs stay equal across all applications, whether it's water access or road. And I'd like to see an increase or a way to start bridging our deficit and making us sustainable through services such as this. Thank you.
Thank you. My perspective is that I'm absolutely not in favor of a fire sale on road allowances, shore road allowances. I think that's totally unfair to our residents who have already purchased their shore road allowance. And I find it interesting when I look at surveys. I would speculate that probably over 3/4 of the properties now do have their shore road allowances owned by the person who owns the land behind. When you look at the jagged lines of who owns what, there's not. I would say most of our shore allowances have already been sold. I think that so to me, a fire sale on that is totally unfair to all those residents. I also think we're selling something that is of great value. This is shoreline on Georgian Bay or inland lakes. That is worth a fortune. And I know many a cottager back in I think it was the late 70s or early 80s or whenever you could start buying shore allowances, many people just lined up because they realized what an opportunity it was. I think that we also know that if people in the cases where we own Shore Road Allowance, there's a liability argument that can be made. Now, I don't think too many cases have been filed in that regard, but I think it behooves us that if people are building on their Shore Road Allowance, that they own it. I also think we're actually giving people a discount. And when I say that, some more than others, because if we measure by straight line, they're going to get a lower figure than if we got a surveyor to do the full thing with all the jiggity jags. It's going to be a bigger number. So by saying that we're going to do the straight line, I'll call planning approach to the Shore Road Allowance, it's actually going to reduce the cost. It won't increase it. Straight lines, you can't get any smaller than a straight line from point A to point B. I think we're actually going to be reducing our income in many cases by taking this approach. But having said that, I also looked, with the exception of the archipelago, all the other comparators that we had were in the same range or noticeably higher. And I think I'm all in favor of recommending $242 per lineal meter. I think that's the fair thing to do to everyone, including the majority of our taxpayers. And I recognize that there are a few individuals who got upset when they found out they had to buy their Shore Road Allowance. And I know the couple examples that I was aware of didn't even know they didn't own it, which makes me wonder about their legal advice when they acquired their property. But that's a separate discussion. I think that it's, to the best of my knowledge, and the Clerks Department can correct me, the majority of people who've come in to buy Shore Road Allowances have accepted the price and are glad to take ownership of that property. So it's not like we have the majority of people coming in yelling and screaming, so to speak, at our Clerks Department saying, how dare you charge me for this property? They're mostly glad to get it done. We've seen that in some of the applications. The applicants have said to us very clearly, they want to own that property. So in other words, my vote clearly will be to support the staff recommendation of $242 per lineal meter. I think it's the fair and the most practical and the easiest, the most straightforward way of doing things going forward. Anybody inclined for a more, yep, Councillor Cooper is some additional comments. Councillor Cooper.
Just very briefly, and it doesn't change the outcome, but I just wanted to point out that there are literally hundreds of kilometers of shoreline in coastal Georgian Bay that don't have mainland, that don't have Shore Road Allowance. Reason being is the property was owned or acquired from the Crown prior to the implementation of the Shore Road Allowance delineation. So that would apply to from Wawatasi. There's a huge area there, a lot of Go Home Bay, a lot of around the Musquash River and the Muskoka Mills. All those shorelines were owned pre-1900. So that's why the impression is that a lot of people have bought their Shore Road Allowance when in fact they didn't have to, just to make things even more confusing. There you go. Thank you.
Councillor Predko.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just wanted to, from my observations and looking at the Shore Road Allowances that were purchased over the last year, there really is no benefit, $12 to $242. Whether you're measuring straight line or area, it does average out. If individual properties will either benefit or be not penalized, but they'll have a higher price than what they would have by the other calculation. It's just the way things will work out on the average, that it is equivalent. And review. I've taken a look at the other comparables. We are on the 242 is I think on the high medium size compared to the other areas. If we're comparing $12 per square meter or $242 linear meters, the other areas that are more expensive are the areas that are obviously the most desirable and expensive, like Muskoka. Category 1 lakes for Muskoka lakes. If you look at the other combinations, I think they're all in the lower $200 or closer to the $10 to $8 on the square meter. So I personally think that the 242 is a little bit high to be reflective of what we see out in the other municipalities. And then I would be hoping we settle on a number that's slightly less than that.
Councillor Hazelton.
Perhaps my memories are different than yours, but if I roll back the clock to the 70s and the 80s and attending FOCA meetings and so on, there was a fear instilled in cottage owners that the townships would come along, and if you had a dock on the property, they would start taxing you for the dock, and if you had a boathouse, they would start taxing you for the boathouse. And so the word on the street back then was any possible way you can buy your show road allowance to avoid these future unknown charges that you'd get from the township was really a good thing to do. Whether the land was valuable or not, in theory, it has no value to anybody else. You generally have full use of that property. And although in theory, somebody in a distressed boat could come and stop on your shore road allowance if you didn't own it and not be trespassing, that was kind of a rare thing. But you know, there was as I say, there was a kind of a word on the street that you buy it because of the risks of what the township would do. In fairness, what the townships would do is what we are doing now, where we are forcing the residents to buy their shore road allowance. We're not taxing them for the buildings of the docks, but we're forcing them to buy their shore road allowance when it is the only path to get to their property for water access properties. So I think that the reality has come full circle, a different issue, but it's come full circle. And I think that we need to be a bit more sensitive to what we're doing to these water access properties, property owners, and I would fully embrace having a different rate structure for these water access properties, either now for an interim or permanently to reflect the different set of criteria. And I think all of the other comparisons that we see here with these other townships where they have much bigger numbers or where they could have much bigger numbers, they're not reflective of our water access community. I think the archipelago is really the only one that's truly reflective of the water only access properties. And I think their rate is the rate that we should be focusing on.
Ms. Wade.
Sorry, I'd just like to make a point of clarification. An SRA is public land, therefore it's a public asset, therefore it can be accessed by any member of the public at any time. So they're not for private use if they're not owned by the individual. Otherwise, anyone can dock their boat, access their dock, and there's nothing anyone can do about it if they don't own their land.
Yeah, what I was referring to was the effective sole use of the property. I mean, what is interesting is people traveling in a boat are not likely to stop at a property. First of all, they may not know that it's purchased or not purchased SRA, but there's a perception of exclusive use, but not a legal requirement, sorry, not a legal ability to define its unique use or to call other authorities like the OPP to deal with, quote, trespassing type issues. So anyways, it's a perception. I get it. You know, technically it's not, but I think what we are really trying to deal with here is trying to be sensitive to the residents who have a need to get to their property, and this is the only path. And anyways, said enough.
Okay, I'm going to make this simple now. I'm going to ask each one of you, give me a number. No argument, no discussion, no ifs, ands, or buts. Just throw a number at me. And I'm going to start with Counselor, I'm going to go in alphabet or I'm going to go in order. These things are listed here in case we had a recorded vote. Just so I'm going to start. Counselor Bocek, your number, please.
I believe it was 240. I don't have the report open, but 242, the amount that was recommended by staff.
Thank you. Counselor Cooper.
Two numbers, 100 and 200. Water access only, 100.
Counselor Predko.
I'm actually going to lean towards the two pricing model. I would say about 150 and about 225.
Thank you. Counselor Hazelton.
With $40 a linear meter,
Yes.
That's not fair.
No.
That's fucking stupid.
160 per linear meter.
Your speaker.
Oh, let's start again here. I'll go with $40 a linear meter, which is $2 a square meter for water access, and $160 a linear meter, which is equivalent to $8 a square meter for non-water only access.
Counselor Jarvis.
I'm leaning on the two price scenario, 242, the staff recommendation, but really for those with water access only, to somewhere around half that.
Sorry, was that one number or two numbers you're giving me?
Two numbers, one for road access and one for
Okay.
water access only.
Counselor Graziano.
I'm going to lean with the staff recommendation of 242 applied to both water as well as land. Thank you.
And for the record, I'm also at 242 because I believe for everybody, because that's basically status quo, which I think is appropriate and which has worked for us for 40 years. Okay, we got lots of variances here. To the best of my knowledge, that last time we did agree on an approach. And at that point, I don't recall a discussion of being a two-tiered approach. I think it was a one appear and therefore the resolution in front of us is recommended a purchase price of. So I'm going to put in 242 and call for the vote, and we'll see whether it carries or not. And I think it's going to be close. CEO Mariotti.
I don't want to belabor the point. However, we do use this revenue stream as part of our budget process. And not only that, but also there are costs involved as well as legal fees and so on with this process. So said enough.
No, but all costs associated with an application are covered. They're separately billed. All we're talking about is the revenue coming from the purchase of the sale of the land. But all the administrative costs, and our clerk highlighted this earlier, I think, is all the administrative costs are separate and distinct from the numbers that we're talking about here. So there should be no cost to the township to go through a purchase application. All the registration costs are covered.
So the legal costs are covered. They're paid via deposit as part of the application being submitted. There is an administration fee, which Sydney, I believe, is $550. $621.50, not $550. And that amount may or may not cover all of our costs and staff time. Some applications are much more complicated than others. But yes, in theory, this is just about the purchase price. But as a whole, the clerk's office is not in a position to be making money off of our administration fees. So we tend to lean on the best case scenario for an application when calculating those costs.
Point of order, Mayor.
Certainly.
I believe when we surveyed our councillors, there were 4 out of the 7 councillors who suggested a 2-tier amount. So I'm not understanding the resolution being just one amount. I'm not getting it. We already know that the majority have suggested a 2-tier amount. Could you comment on that, please?
Happy to comment on it. To the best of my knowledge, we had approved, council had approved a policy to go into a linear meter policy. And now we're looking at the price. So we did not talk about having a 2-tiered system when we approved that policy.
Correct, but we just surveyed our counselors and heard from 4 of them saying 2-tier. So I thought you were suggesting that we vote on 242, not a 2-tier approach.
Yeah, I think, okay, if you like, we can do another round talking about 2-tiered versus 1-tier. I think we're going in circles here. But if we want to have another round, let's talk. We don't have to go home. We can make this complicated as much as we want. Let's talk about 2-tiered versus single-tiered. We've never had that in our township the last 40 years. So if we want to go 2-tiered versus 1-tiered, let's go. Councillor Graziano, we'll start with you.
Your worship, if I can make a recommendation, can we just vote on it rather than talk about it?
Well,
Thank you.
okay.
I'd like to say something.
No, actually, Councillor Graziano, you put the motion on the floor. Councillor Graziano has requested the motion be called. Therefore, the procedural bylaw forces us to end the discussion and call the vote.
Okay,
I'd like a recorded vote.
certainly. Oh, I have to read the motion first, don't I? Yeah. The motion reads, moved by Councillor Cooper, seconded by Councillor Bocek. Be it resolved, the Committee of the Whole recommends the purchase price at $242 per lineal meter, and that staff be directed to bring forward an updated fees and charges bylaw.
All properties. Because what Councilor Cooper is implying is that we consider.
Sound.
Can we turn the mic on so we can hear remotely here?
Okay, so I think we need to be clear in this resolution that it is to apply to all properties at your recommended 242 number. Because what Councillor Cooper was getting at was the interest in introducing a 2-tier structure, which there appears to be some interest in. So we want to be clear that this is not a 2-tier structure.
I think we can say this is not a 2-tier structure because when we approved a pricing policy back in whenever month it was a 1-tier system that we approved.
Yeah.
We did not contemplate, at that point, we approved a 1-tier system, and now is simply the discussion of the price. And I think all council understands that this motion is for a 1-tiered system. Over to the clerk.
Let the record show recorded vote was requested by Councillor Cooper. Councillor Cooper, how do you vote?
Sorry, no.
Councillor Bocek, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Graziano, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Hazelton, how do you vote?
No.
Councillor Jarvis, how do you vote?
I'm gonna vote yes.
Councillor Predko, how do you vote?
No.
Mayor Kutsier, how do you vote?
Yes.
Let the record show the motion carries 4-3.
All right, thank you very much.
Just, Mr. Mayor, for a moment,
Councillor Jarvis.
just as a follow-up, I'm very curious if we can, I don't know how much effort it is, determine one, how many properties in the archipelago are subject to SRA? Because I just out of curiosity, I don't know if that's an issue or not. And then, because my observation here is we don't have a lot of properties that are water access only in our municipality, to my knowledge, that will have SRAs. There will be some, but not many. And I'm curious to know how many there would be there as well. Anyway, just for information purposes.
At this time, staff don't have the means to estimate what we have, let alone what someone else has. Sorry. It's a great question, one we've asked ourselves.
We have a new business item on our agenda, and that is the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation November 2022 newsletter. Councillor Hazelton, you put this on the agenda
Yes, I did.
to speak to this matter, or is there a pending resolution attached to this matter?
I haven't prepared a resolution, but we'll get there in a moment. So the purpose of my wanting to add this into COW was to, first of all, encourage all of us to read the material that was provided by the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation and become sensitive to a couple of issues or a few issues that they've highlighted. And just to kind of connect a few dots here, the author of this is Mary Muter, and she is also spearheading the water quality testing that is being done through the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation with Dr. Patchow Fraser. What I'm trying to do there is just highlight the expertise, the level of expertise and information that is being brought to our attention. So if I could just scroll forward, so to speak, to a couple of items here. On page 13 of the package, the second paragraph down talks about the increase in York Region's existing intra-basin transfers from Lake Simcoe down through to Lake Ontario. And if people don't know, Newmarket and the areas of York Region used to pull all their water out of Lake Simcoe and discharge back into Lake Simcoe, and then they created a partnership with Durham, and so the sewage is sent down into Durham, which then discharges into Lake Ontario. Now, if you read through the report, you will observe that there is an international agreement that prevents further movement of water from one Great Lakes type basin to another, and Lake Simcoe drains into Georgian Bay. And now what we are doing is seeing that York Region is pulling water out of the Georgian Bay catchment area and discharging it into Lake Ontario, and our municipal government don't seem to care.
Our provincial government.
Sorry, our provincial government, and maybe our municipal government doesn't care either. Anyways, I wanted to raise the sensitivity and visibility of that because there may be some actions that we can take as a township to help support the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation in this as they struggle to get attention at the various different governmental levels. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was if we come down to page 16 of 24 in that package, Mary has included the projected water levels as we go out in time. And even in the short-term window, 2023, we're seeing that the water levels are actually getting fairly low for Michigan Huron lakes. And if you kind of scroll down to some of the other charts, we start to see some longer term trends that are actually pretty scary. Now, you may remember going back to the 2012, 2011, 2013, 14 era, where we had a stop the drop program. And one of the things that I have wrestled with my own mind is there is nobody who is able to give us a very crisp reason why we're getting these long-term water level changes in Georgian Bay. But there are patterns, there are long-term patterns where the water does go up and down. But what the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation has learned in their research is that there are things that are happening in the St. Clair River that are causing the water levels to become more extreme. And so on page 17 of 24, you will see a few lines down, it talks about the decline is related to an ice jam in the St. Clair River that has caused erosion in the riverbed and the increased water flow. So I'm not going to try to walk us through all of the details there, but this seems to be a well understood problem where the St. Clair River is essentially being gouged out as a result of ice jams and high intensity water flows down the St. Clair River, which is basically augering out the bed of the St. Clair River and flushing it down into Lake Erie. So what we are observing then is, the lack of an ability by man to control some of the problems that are taking place that appear to be getting worse over time. Now, what we all also need to understand is Lake Michigan and Huron are the two central Great Lakes, and they are the only Great Lakes that are not level controlled. Lake Superior is level controlled, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, all level controlled, but the central two Great Lakes are not. And so there may be, and likely is, an opportunity for man to get involved with the characteristics of what's going on specifically in the St. Clair River, and perhaps provide some moderation to these extreme water levels. And that's essentially what the Georgian Great Lakes Foundation has been talking about for a while now.
Can I ask you to get now towards what you want council to do? Because we've all read the report, at least we should have, because it was in our package. So if you could now get us towards what are you looking for from council, I think it would be appreciated.
Cut off in the middle of my rant.
Okay, and so quite intentionally so.
Quite intentionally. So what, and I don't have it for today, but what the Georgian Great Lakes Foundation would appreciate is a letter of support from our township in their activities in working with these different government entities to reflect the support that we have of our concerns in these widely varying water levels on Georgian Bay. The Township of the Archipelago has provided such a letter, and I have a copy of something from Mary Muter that we could consider. I didn't think that we wanted to, well, we can't force an action here in Cow, but I would be prepared to come to the February meeting of council with a letter that we could consider in the way of supporting, not financially, but supporting in message, the efforts that the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation is doing to try to get attention of the other municipalities around the central Great Lakes to attempt to allow human intervention to these wide swings and to moderate these water levels.
So you've put this on our agenda basically as an information item.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what to do with, I'm going to make this suggestion to council as a whole. I don't know what to do as chair of a meeting with an information item other than just to provide it, unless there is some motion or action suggested at which council can then decide whether or not they do such.
Well, if I may, Mayor, I would, the intention of this was for anyone who wanted to discuss it, we could, because there may be questions that might come up or not. But if everyone is comfortable with their review of the material, then I would say no need for any further action in today's meeting. But just as to let you know, I would be prepared to come forward with a recommended letter of support that we could consider at a future council meeting.
Councilor Bochek, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, this is so far out of my lane, I don't even know where to begin. I don't understand the science. I've tried to. A year ago, we were going to bombard trees with pesticides to kill gypsy moth because of the science, and they never showed up. I don't get this whole thing. I need to have delegations. I need scientists to prove to me that there's some sort of viable action that this township can take to get involved in this. Personally, I think we have a lot more local issues we need to be involved with and spend our energy towards that. But those are my thoughts, because Councillor Hazelton brought this to council to feel out our thoughts of what we thought about it. So I just aired mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Be more than happy to consider this a council meeting. In fact, I'd be happy to second any motion that relates to doing something. We are on the Great Lakes, and it has a huge impact on our township. That's where our border is, and the western portion of our township. So let's be mindful of that. And I would support that we work on this, because it's quite clear that the science seems to be telling us that we have the biggest issue on the Middle Great Lakes. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillor like to make any additional comments? Councillor Jarvis.
Just going to echo Councillor Cooper's thoughts. I think I'm really happy to hear that Councillor Hayes just brought it to our attention. And I think that if he brings something to us in February, I'd be very favorable to promoting support however we can to the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation. Because the science they provide is very important to us. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to make my observation is that as far as I am concerned, from my perspective, the Great Lakes water levels is a definite concern of this township, because it's our western boundary, and many of our residents live on Georgian Bay, and we're very much aware of the fluctuations of our water levels and how they are greater than the other Great Lakes, and the lack of man-made controls in the St. Clair River area is probably a significant factor in all that. I found it very interesting, just as a sidebar, going to a presentation, I believe made by the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation, and they're trying to explain the ups and downs of the water levels, and the closest thing they could find that paralleled the ups and downs was sunspot activity, which I thought was really interesting, but I'm not sure how we can use that. But having said that, I would like to say to council that on a go-forward basis, I would prefer that anything that comes in front of council has a decision or recommendation in front of us to consider. I think that Councillor Hazelton's suggestion of bringing forward a letter of support makes perfect sense, because then council can decide whether or not we think we should sign or modify such a letter. Bringing something forward that's just for information should, in my mind, should be part of the CIP package, because then that's for our information. And I have a definite concern that our council meetings have, over the past few years, drifted longer and longer and longer, and I'd like to see us try to make them more efficient. And therefore, anything I would hope that anything that comes in front of us in the future would have a, let me call it, a decision for us to make one way or another, not just for information, because then that should, just for information should be in our CIP package. I mean, I find I had received this letter personally in the past, and I found it interesting reading. But I think we need to have in the future, anything in front of us have an action attached to it, for which council can or cannot be in favor. With that, I'm not aware of any other business we have for committee of the whole at this point. So I have a motion by Councillor Jarvis, seconded by Councillor Hazelton. Be it resolved that committee of the whole does now adjourn at 12:32 p.m. to reconvene on February 14th, Valentine's Day, or at the call of the chair. Sorry, you said you wanted flowers if we meet that day? Okay. 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 Staff would like us to have flowers that day. But that's not part of the motion. All in favor of the motion as I read it. And that is carried. Thank you very much.